7 things you want in Factorio version 2.1. In my last wishlist video, I asked what changes and features you would want for version 2.1, and boy did you deliver. As well as being my most watched video to date, thank you, I can't tell you how grateful I am for that, it was also my most commented on video. Now, to be fair, this is YouTube, so a large proportion of those comments were, "You're dumb, your ideas are dumb, go away Mr. Dummy," and not always in such polite terms. But in amongst all the comments questioning my parentage were some really interesting suggestions. Indeed, there were too many for me to cover them all in detail, but I did notice some major trends. So today we're going to talk about 7 features that you, or my commenters anyway, most want in Factorio version 2.1. Oh, and there's a couple of other ideas from me in here as well too. Quick start. Understandably, a lot of your comments were aligned quite closely to my suggestions, but refining and adjusting them. The most discussion, not least because a lot of people only watched the first part, was around quick start. Comments are still happening, but on top of those that were simply in support of the idea, I had 28 suggestions for alternate versions or tweaks to my original proposal, and 3 key themes emerged. Firstly, bot start. Secondly, a meta progression system, and thirdly, an alternate planet start. Quick start, bots. The first tweak, bot start, is pretty obvious. There were variations such as giving both power armor and unlocking the techs as well, but the core theme was the suggestion that you simply start with a bunch of construction robots. I think this is a perfectly good suggestion, although the issue this is mostly targeting is reducing early game hand building. And for me, personally, that's not the most annoying thing, but I can understand why it is for others. I generally bot rush, so I have construction bots and loggy bots as soon as I can, and for me, the tedium tends to kick in a bit later. I do also want to give a bit of a nod to Happy Haffer 1403 and Charred Utensil, who had some additional suggestions. Charred Utensil suggested an early game crane. I believe the idea was that this would sit in the middle of your base and build things from a blueprint, but it would be a fixed, unmovable building, perhaps part of your crashed ship, so it could only build in a certain range. I think this adds a nice constriction to the idea of early game building that means you have a nice additional challenge of fitting things into a small space. And Happy Haffer suggested a spaceship base and a limited special building that can produce rocket parts as well. I think this is a very interesting idea, and it's something I'd particularly like to see tackled by a mod. Quick start, meta progression. Another idea that got quite a few suggestions was to introduce a kind of meta progression to the game. I've often noted that while Factorio isn't really a roguelike game, it shares a lot of elements with that genre. The map is randomised, Factorio has high system complexity, and combat is really the only way of dealing with enemies, for example. But how Factorio is secretly the best roguelike ever made deserves its own video, dedicated to annoying as many roguelike fans as I possibly can. The point is more that the many roguelite games that develop from this genre also add a meta progression. But what is a meta progression? Well, in a pure roguelike game, each new run is independent from the past run. You don't carry anything over from past runs. In many roguelites, you do. What you carry over varies, but it can be skills, resources, armour, weapons, things that are useful for the next run basically. By doing this, each run adds to this meta or high-level progression, making later runs easier or allowing you to get further. The idea is that you get to skip doing the very early stuff, which can get boring the more it's repeated. And maybe it also allows the game to have a story or narrative that you can advance without having to repeat it all. The idea for Factorio then is that you would accumulate something that allows you to skip the early phases of the game. This could be tech points or coins or whatever, and you could then spend these at the start of a new game. I really like this concept, as it then allows you to customise your quick start. So, you could focus on unlocking techs maybe, but I could buy bots and armour instead, like in the previous suggestion. I think the challenge here is what does it mean to accumulate these points? I think it would need to be the same fixed pool that you have at the start of every game after your first, because you could have multiple games on the go at the same time. And they could be modded. It could get quite complex is what I'm saying. I also want to give a shout out to Akalisa5894 and Calliador, who, although they weren't quite talking about meta-progression, between them suggested a good addition to this concept. Firstly, that the things you buy could be the cargo of your ship, so it literally gives you mining drills or whatever in the ship, and also that, depending on how many techs you unlock, it affects the look of your crashed ship. The idea is that, in this version of the Factorio universe, you are more technologically advanced, so your ship is too, which I think is a nice little visual touch. Alternate planets. I've lumped these in together, but really this was a mixture of a way of achieving quick start. Volcanus, for example, may be easier to get started on with its infinite resources, while also giving you more variety for the early game. If you recall from the first video, the underlying point was that you have to play through a big chunk of the normal, unchanged game just to get to the new stuff. Starting on a new planet would alleviate both of these issues. You've instantly got more variety just from where you're building and what you're doing. Even gathering basic resources is different. Scrap on Fogora, lava on Volcanus, and pain on Gleba. And maybe the grind is alleviated because you're going to get better buildings earlier, so you're more productive and it makes it quicker. But, more fundamentally, I think this is an interesting idea because of the whole roguelike thing again. As I hinted at before, a procedurally generated map is a key strength for Factorio. It means that, even if it's all the same, it's also different. And the fact it has sliders for terrain, resources, and enemies means you can shape the game further as well. A fixed map can be great. It allows for more specific and directed design, for example. But I think for many Factorio players, the different start is part of the appeal. Extending this to starting on different planets is, therefore, an appealing concept. I do think there's potentially some balancing issues that we would need to address. However, if this was done as a new game plus option, I think that becomes less of a concern. Making it an option for more experienced players with a warning that you do this at your own risk seems like the easiest way to go. If it was something you specifically had to pay for through a meta-progression system, then that's even better. Do you spend money starting somewhere else or having more bots, for example? It's a form of balancing without actually having to change anything. Though who'd want to pay to start on Gleba, I don't know. Or maybe getting started on Gleba would give you more points since it's harder. Oh, and shout out to Diceman20, So Much Facepalm, and Olden Son, who also suggested starting in space. I realised through replying to all the comments on the last video that, for me personally, space isn't a big enough element in the expansion. As I said on a few replies, it's more like New Planet Age than it is Space Age. Space becomes more like a railway track than an actual separate component of the expansion. I think that's why I keep banging on about spaceships home and megastructures and building in space. It turns out I wanted to do more space stuff than I wanted to do more planet stuff. A space elevator. The next big area that got some significant feedback was the whole planetary hubs and transferring things between platforms. The latter, platform transfer, didn't receive too many novel suggestions, but for platform-to-planet transfer, a good number of people seemed quite keen for there to be multiple planetary hubs. I get why this request is there, but I also get why Wooby didn't allow it. The whole point is that if you have multiple hubs, then it trivialises a large part of the game. You don't need to move things around on the ground anymore, just lift them into orbit. But I think there's some merit in considering Marcus Woveland 3277's idea of making it an infinite research, or the idea proposed by Heintger MTB of making it one hub for science and another for everything else. Quite a few people also suggested the more obvious solution of it being a different type of hub. I confess my idea of doing it with different components on the hub was me trying to come up with something that I think is more likely to be added. I really want platform transfer mechanics in the game, and I felt adding a new module was probably more likely than a whole new hub type, hence why I came up with a rather convoluted solution. However, I confess that what I would really like to see added is what these commenters suggested, which is a space elevator. There's obviously a thing here where you get closer and closer to simply implementing all of the space exploration mod in Space Age, but I do think that the Factorio version could be made unique enough that it's still distinct. And besides, it's not like SpaceX invented the concept of space elevators from scratch. It's an idea that's been floating around since the late 19th century. Anyway, I think a space elevator could solve both the platform-to-platform transfer and increased planetary throughput issues quite easily. And it could be done in a way that makes it a late-game megabase thing as well. The idea would simply be to add modules to the elevator that expand its capacity. Perhaps, on the elevator itself, there are platform docks and elevator shaft modules that you can build multiple of. While the platforms don't necessarily need to be shown as actually docking, it could simply be the pods moving about. This would achieve the platform-to-platform transfer idea. And adding more elevator shafts would allow you to increase the throughput. Each could simply act like a high-speed transport belt. To gate or slow down the elevator upgrading, the modules could be hyper expensive and or locked behind additional research. Perhaps you could add 3 in the normal game, for example, but a new Promethean research could let you add as many as you want. A nice little extra idea here would be to add train loading and unloading docks at the base of the elevator. Again, this could be a module that you build that maybe also requires research to unlock. That way, it could be gated so it doesn't make the main part of the game too easy. This solution could even achieve the multiple hubs people want. You simply add more space elevators at different points. And this could have some reasonable restrictions, like a minimum distance between each one and needing to all be in a straight line. After all, an orbital ring is another common addition to the elevator idea in a lot of science fiction. Last off, quick shout out to Tom6T8C, who proposed mini trains for platforms. I really like this idea. In my head, these are fast minecart-like trains that zip back and forth along a single tile-wide rail line. Perhaps they could carry a very large amount of stuff very quickly, beating belts, but have some restrictions like you can't cross them over, and you can only load and unload at special loader hubs to stop them being OP. Space trains are in the SpaceX mod, so this could also be a nice halfway house between belts and Space Age repeating SpaceX trains. Combat improvements. Okay, those are all refinements and tweaks to my last video. Let's look at a couple of areas where you had some completely new suggestions. An area that got a surprising number of suggestions for version 2.1 was combat. I've separated this up into enemies and better fighting. Better fighting. There were a few suggestions for improvements or changes to the way some of the combat systems work, including a call for automation of defences from TobyDodds4515, who wanted more automation of offensive combat against the biters. Erekimel Blau 877, who wanted to have some more automation for Spidertrons, and Prof Bits, who wanted to automate everything from cannon shells to deploying capsules. Prof Bits also wanted some adjustments to artillery so it's a bit smarter, some connection to the signal network perhaps. And TobyDodds4515 wanted a huge expansion to combat bots. This included having more types of combat bots, one-arms with flamers for example, and a system for deploying them automatically by the player. Automation of throwables in particular is something I discussed a lot back in the OG Friday Facts videos, so I very much agree with this concept. I don't know if these automation ideas will ever happen, but I do think it would be in keeping with the game that's about automating everything to be able to automate everything. Mensa Bend had a great suggestion, which is adding some more military capability to trains. They suggested, among other things, a wagon that has a flamer turret, which sounds both highly impractical and a huge amount of fun. BBrenny194 suggested giving us the ability to limit turret fields of fire, which I think is a great idea that would be hugely helpful on platforms, as they suggest. It would also work really well with our next few suggestions. Izai8BU simply cuts right to the heart of the matter and asks for Space War, while Sandovass3954 gives us the specific example of blending Factorio with Cosmotea and Star Sector. And you may have noticed that Mensa Bend also wanted some sort of RTS mode for Factorio, an Age of Factorio if you will. While these last few feel more like mods than version 2.1 additions, I certainly think that space is ripe for some more combat. And as you'll see in the enemies section, some sort of spaceborne threat was mentioned a few times there too. Lastly, I wanted to talk in a bit more detail about Nova's suggestion of orbital bombardment lasers. If this ends up being a longer running series, I'd like to do a whole episode dedicated to combat and enemies, but for now, let's chat about orbital bombardment. I think the lasers idea is interesting. I hadn't really even considered it, but another alternative would be artillery. Perhaps in true engineer style, we could strap 5 shells together and launch them at the surface with a mega cannon. Either way, there are a few things to consider. It would likely be OP. I mean, by design, why would anyone bother with it if it didn't easily wipe out everything in a huge area? So some sort of restriction would be needed. Otherwise it could make combat so trivial it would be boring. The resource cost is an obvious thing to use as a limiter. That could mean physical resources like making each shot expensive, but could also use resources that you can't find in space. The other limiting vector could be power, which is more abundant in space, but so much power could be needed that you need a ridiculously sized platform rammed full of accumulators to fire it, and they take a while to recharge. Another limit could be range. It could be that you have to move the platform into position, think Spidertron remote, before it will fire. Therefore, it wouldn't be very useful for mobile enemies, but could be great for insta-clearing an area to expand your factory. Obviously, it would need to be an endgame research too, otherwise the mid-game combat could become trivial. But the point is it would be kinda cool to design a special orbital laser space platform and go all Blofeld. Also, just to note, my personal suggestion for this type of weapon system, now that we have tungsten in the game, would be rods from God. If you don't know this phrase, the idea is that you launch huge metal rods into space that you then drop from orbit onto your intended target. It's basically a kinetic energy weapon, like dropping an asteroid on something, but in a theoretically more controlled way. Tungsten is a good material to use for something like this as it's super dense. It therefore has a relatively small size for the energy it can deliver, which makes it easier to handle. My idea then would be to make these rods in space. You'd have to launch up tons of tungsten and other materials, which would give it an interesting logistical challenge. It would also be another weapon, like artillery, that uses material from volcanoes, but that is actually more useful on Nauvis and Gleba, so it needs transporting. Changes to enemies. There are a few suggestions for changes and additions to enemies, but the most popular were the introduction of enemies on Fulgora and some adjustments to the behaviours of biters. The real structure actually called for enemies on all planets, but Captain Matthew 661 and Eve Scepter both suggested a mechanised enemy for Fulgora. Eve Scepter actually outlined several nice ideas for enemies on several planets. These included a demolisher egg that would hatch and repopulate the enemy territories. The lack of demolisher eggs or similar is actually something I'm going to pick up in one of my lore videos when I get back to those. For Fulgora, they suggested an enemy that lies dormant. It's reanimated by the lightning and then rebuilds an army of their kind and attacks your base. That random nature of such attacks and the fact that it can always happen just outside your base makes them both distinct and similar to biters. Eve Scepter also suggested adding more resistances to biters. And totally not a supervillain, I believe you, Erekimel Blur 877 and JCE Was Here all added to the call for changes to biter behaviour. I like the ideas of ramping up the swarm attacks of biters. I've discussed many times before in the Friday Facts videos and on stream the issues with late game biters. They basically become a non-thing in no small part because the colonisation and pollution response waves are quite pathetic compared to your tech level. If they ramped up, and I think building biolabs is a really good suggestion here for triggering it, then it would give you something more interesting to deal with, even if you do eventually still outbuff them. Profbits also suggested a Fulgora enemy, but they specifically proposed a tweak to strafers on Gleba, making the high tier ones even more destructive. As if Gleba needed to get any more miserable. So yeah, tweaks to the enemies was a common suggestion, though not all the enemy changes were about combat. Wolfenknife suggested that the Gribbly alien become some sort of pet, or that animal farming be added to the game. Although they did also suggest making Gribbly a space alien, which I confess I was somewhat surprised wasn't a more common suggestion. New machines, processes, modes or features. I'm being a bit cheeky here because I've lumped these suggestions together, but they are actually quite distinct. However, it was clear that there are plenty of people who want a bigger, more significant addition to the game. I wouldn't be surprised if they did add something more substantial, so let's look at your ideas. First off, bbrenny194 suggested adding offshore oil patches and all that entails. One of my personal favourite mini overhaul mods is the cargo ship mod, which I think really adds some interesting new mechanics to the game. While I think it would have some issues for general inclusion in the vanilla game, I'd love to see an official version of this mod. Next up, RetRetLol and Nova both suggested a general overhaul to Gleba to make it more in keeping with the rest of the game and make the rewards more enticing. I definitely agree with the poor rewards. What you get from Gleba is not really as widely applicable and useful when compared to Volcanus and Folgora. Gleba needs something that's much more integral to general progress and makes all the other planets easier in the same way that the Foundry, EMP, Mech Armor and Artillery do. Next up, Lizard of Oz suggested adding some sort of surface at the shattered planet. Clearly this wouldn't be a planet, but I could see there being some super huge chunk of bulb that's left over that you could land on and use to give you more to do with Promethium. I'll actually be picking this idea up if I do more of these wishlist videos. Cohen Vanderridged 5244 makes a suggestion for improving quality by switching it up for a refinement process. I guess the idea would be that you have to loop the material through a number of refining steps to make it into a higher quality level. That way, if each refinement took more material, higher quality could still be materially expensive but would become more predictable. The Real Structure had a very interesting suggestion for a new machine, a circuit board that enables you to build the advanced circuits but takes up less space. I'm assuming this will be something different to the EMP. They also suggested an improved display of your rocket logistics. It can be a real mystery what's happening with rockets. I've told this story a number of times before, but at the pre-launch LAN party, I got stuck on Nauvis because I was trying to build a platform to go to Folgora, but all the rockets were busy servicing the orders from other platforms. There didn't seem to be any way to see where my platform orders were in the queue or to prioritise them. In the end, I had to hijack one of the rockets, set it to manual, and launch all of my stuff that way. Eve Scepter makes a different suggestion for a new building in the form of a kind of super beacon. They propose a big tower that has a huge number of slots and that covers a huge area. I'm guessing this wouldn't stack, that is, each building can only be affected by one tower, or it could be a bit nuts. Ranger MTB made an intriguing suggestion about getting the ability to add power poles in place of signals along elevated rails. That way you could run power alongside the elevated rails. And Prof Bits made the point that we now have the ability to automate wood production on Nauvis, but no real use for it. They specifically suggested wooden walls and a way to convert wood to carbon. Of these, the latter sounds like a viable addition for a long-term use for wood. I think setting up tree farms that you use to make carbon and carbon fibre sounds like an interesting extra mechanic that gives us more ways to do things. Lastly, I'd like to highlight Kuliet 805's suggestion of adding decorations. This was another thing I was hopefully going to cover in a future wishlist video, but let's take a look at it now instead. I think an easy way that decoration could be added without any real change would be to add coloured concrete. In the mods that add decoration, these are usually specifically craftable recipes, but I'd prefer if this was some sort of thing you could set like lamps. That is, they simply add a colour picker for concrete that lets you select whatever colour you want. Or perhaps a new spray gun could be added that allows you to paint whatever colour you want onto the concrete. If they don't want to allow coloured concrete, I think, at the very least, having a couple of hazard concrete colour variations would be a nice touch. It would be a great way to personalise your factory. Perhaps on one planet you use one colour of hazard concrete and on another you use a different colour. Or maybe you have different hazard concrete around rocket silos compared to around your machines, and then a third colour around your trains. The point is that even a little variation could go a long way. However, what I'd really like is for this to be extended further with differently coloured walls, and maybe even different types of walls, chain link fences, wooden walls. For those that saw my aesthetic Factorio streams, you know what I'm talking about. Gravel in different colours, asphalt for roads, different coloured elevated rails, signs and displays, different gate types, and that's not even getting started on space platforms. There are all sorts of things that could be added to let us customise our factories and make them more individual. Tweaks! I've left the biggest group of comments until number 7, but it's not quite the same as the others. Basically, by far and away the biggest grouping of suggestions were what I've called tweaks, although it also includes a lot of stuff that's about quality of life. I'm flashing them up on screen so you can see how many there were, but I'm probably going to do a separate video on them as there's far too many. What's more, I think a lot of these are actually more likely to be implemented, or at the very least are worthy of some more in-depth discussion on their own. Just for clarity, that's not a diss on the rest of the suggestions. I don't think anything I suggested in my first video will actually make it in either. That wasn't really the point. I do a lot of speculation on this channel, it's kind of my whole bag. So while I'm hoping we get a couple of big things in version 2.1, the point of the last video was just to have fun speculating about what might change. What I am going to do though is use this as a chance to talk about a couple of tweaks that I'd like to see for version 2.1. The display panel. Remember this guy? The display panel? The little TV guy? The one that was going to help you see what was happening in your factory more easily? No more building super complex arrays of combinators and all that jazz? Just plug him in and he shows you what's going on? Yeah, no, I hardly use it either. And you know why? Because it doesn't show me the numbers I put in it unless I use some hugely complex set of conditions. And even then it's bucketed. Getting it to show something when the amount is between two values is easy enough, but getting it to show the exact amount dynamically is just painful. Oh sure, you can chain a bunch of them together and do some complex combinator stuff, but I thought that's what these guys were here to avoid. I just want to hook them up and get them to show me how much coal is in a chest, or set of chests for a railway station. That's it. I don't want to mess about with all the other stuff, just give me the number. I remember being so excited about them when I read the Friday Facts. Finally, some easy way to show me what's going on. But no. And as for the notes feature, isn't that what pins are for? So yeah, suggestion number 1 is to add a mode for the display panel that allows it to just output the number of any item you select that it's receiving. It's a simpler tweak as that. If I'm sending it 1,337 coals, let me select coals and it just shows me that number of coals. When it changes, the display changes. You can, of course, fake this with a combinator and power pole, but the point is just to give me this functionality with no faff. Proper blueprint editing in-game. My second tweak that I'd like to see for version 2.1 is proper blueprint editing. At the moment, all we can really do to edit blueprints is remove items from them by right-clicking on the item in the blueprint, which can be staggeringly hard to do for a huge blueprint, and to use upgrade planners to make some tweaks. So we can use an upgrade planner to swap or upgrade modules or go to high-level belts, for example. But we can't add an extra belt. This is often a massive pain because you may just want to make a small edit to the blueprint, like adding a couple of belts, but you've got to place the whole blueprint down, edit it, and then re-blueprint it. To be fair, you don't necessarily have to actually build the blueprint, you can ghost it, but still it can be a real pain. To the extent that sometimes when I know a large, complex blueprint needs a small tweak, I'll simply make that tweak every time I place the blueprint rather than re-blueprint it, especially if it's a tileable blueprint. So the tweak here is simple. Let us edit blueprints like we were interacting with them on the map. Let us add items, open machines, edit their recipes, fiddle with circuit network settings, change parameterization, etc, etc, etc. Other refinements. To finish us off, there were also some areas of refinement on my other ideas, but I'm not sure these really count as big, popular ideas like the others. I'm therefore going to trip through them fairly quickly just for completeness. Heat management. I clearly didn't do a very good job of explaining my refrigeration and freezing idea, as there were a lot of people interpreting it as get rid of spoilage, but that was never really my intent. One of the things I don't like about spoilage is that you can't actually do anything about it. Almost every other process in the game you can speed up or upgrade or get a better version of or what have you. You get free stuff out of the new machines. You can make everything faster with quality machines. You can stick modules in all over the place to make things more efficient or use less resources or what have you. And you can actually improve some things that are themselves doing the improvement. So you can get quality modules and quality beacons. Not so with spoilage. It's always the same, and your only real options are to make stuff faster or make more stuff. Which is fine, but I'd rather have some process that I can set up and optimize to reduce the speed of spoilage. And what a lot of people didn't seem to get was that I want that system to be more complex than the existing solutions. I want there to be a choice of how you do it, though obviously megabases will probably do all of it. I think you could even make it so that unless you get it perfect, it's worse than normal spoilage, and I'd be happy with that. Chilled or frozen things would still spoil, and perhaps if they hit a certain temperature they spoil instantly, for example. So if you don't design a system that can properly take advantage of this mechanic, then it's actually worse than not bothering. But the point is I wanted a systemic solution for spoilage that I can optimize, not to get rid of it. These comments I'm showing made some suggestions for that, including using ice in the early game and fluoroketone later on. Interestingly, there were also a couple of calls for more temperature mechanics in general. An end. A few commenters vibed with my call for a definitive endgame, and suggestions included some sort of communication back home from the Real Structure and Dralord 1307, a nicely detailed suggestion for the ship to take you home from Rapture Sinking 9503, and building an FTL engine using Promethium from Happy Haffer 1403. More science. And speaking of uses for Promethium, there are a lot of very interesting suggestions here too from Professor Bits about using it to give a better output or acting as a substitute resource in recipes. However, rather than specific uses for Promethium, most people focused more on suggesting new techs, infinite ones in particular. Most sound like late game, so I'm going to assume that they could use Promethium science. HeinJMTB suggested solar efficiency. This could make solar more of a competitor late game. Toronto Dono and Rue of Landarin both want to have some personal upgrade researches. I confess I still don't understand why health is the only thing that we can upgrade on the character, or even how that works at all. And Totally Not a Supervillain, I believe you, had a whole bucket list of infinite techs. Environmental control on Nalvis, better ore processing on Vulcanus, a robot crab melee unit on Gleba to give Spidertron something to think about, special logistics fluid bots, and a tech that lets you use cryoplants as improved oil refineries. Overall, to me, I think these suggestions are touching at a key underlying issue with the number goes up endgame, which is that the majority of the infinite techs actually become a bit pointless in terms of their benefit. As Totally Not a Supervillain, I believe you, says at the end, some way to cap prod researches at 40 so you don't waste your time researching useless techs. In a sense, the Megabase endgame really doubles down on just making a number go up for the sake of making a number go up. And I'm not convinced that this is quite enough for all but the hardcore big number enjoyers. Cursed. And finally, to finish us off, I have to give a special mention to the most cursed suggestion by far, from Absolute Catastrophe, who requested, and I quote, "I want to date the aliens." Nuff said. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It's obviously a very different format to the first wishlist video, which I'll link on screen at the end. I've been wanting to do more of these viewer comments, ideas and suggestions videos, but the tone can be a bit difficult to get right. Hopefully I didn't come across as dismissing any of your ideas. I think almost all the suggestions are perfectly valid, and I did enjoy reading all of the comments, even if I kind of ran out of steam replying to them. Well, I got a bit bored of the very basic, your ideas are bad and wrong and you should be ashamed of yourself type comments, but there you go, this is YouTube. Anyway, ideas are still coming in over there. I could fill about 3 videos already. But if you've got any suggestions I didn't go through here, then do pop them in the comments below. And maybe I'll be misreading your username in a future video instead.